It is 3 in the morning. You are awake, not because of a sound, not because of pain, just awake. And there it is again. That thought, that feeling, the one that waits for you when everything else goes quiet. You cannot name it exactly. It does not announce itself, but you know it is there, beneath the surface, pressing upward, asking to be seen. This is not new. It has been with you for years, maybe decades, showing up at the edges of dreams, in the pause between tasks, in the moment before sleep finally comes. And you have learned to move past it, to stay busy, to keep the lights on, to fill the silence with anything that drowns it out. But at night, the defenses rest, and what you buried rises. Tonight, we are going to sit with that rising, not to fix it, not to make it go away, but to understand it. Because over a century ago, a man in Vienna began asking a question that changed how we see the human mind. He asked, what happens to the things we cannot let ourselves remember? His name was Sigmund Freud. And whether you agree with him or not, whether you find his ideas outdated or profound, he understood something that most of us still struggle with today. He understood that the mind protects itself, that certain truths are too painful to hold in daylight, and that those truths do not disappear. They just move underground. Freud called this repression, and he spent his life tracing how buried memories return in dreams, in slips of the tongue, in symptoms that make no medical sense, in the feeling that wakes you at 3 a.m. with no clear explanation. Tonight, we are going to follow that trace. We are going to explore what Freud meant when he said, "The unconscious never forgets." Why the mind buries certain experiences. How those buried experiences speak through the body. What dreams are really doing while you sleep. And why sometimes the only way to find peace is to stop running from what you have been hiding, even from yourself. This will not be a lecture. It will be a conversation, a story, a quiet examination of what happens inside us when we are too tired to pretend. If you have ever felt that something is stuck inside you, something you cannot name, cannot reach, cannot release, this is for you. If you have ever wondered why certain thoughts return no matter how many times you push them away, this is for you. If you have ever woken in the middle of the night with a feeling that has no clear source, this is for you. Freud was not always right. His theories have been challenged, revised, sometimes discarded entirely. But he was right about this. The mind has a basement, and what we store there does not stay there. It finds a way back. So tonight we descend, not to confront, not to judge, just to see. And maybe by the end, something will feel different. Not solved, not fixed, just understood. Let us begin. Chapter 2, Map of the Unconscious. Freud believed the mind was not one thing. It was a landscape, layered, divided, often at war with itself. At the surface, the part you experience as you is consciousness. This is what you are aware of right now. The words you are hearing, the room around you, the thoughts you can name. But consciousness, Freud said, is just a sliver. Beneath it lies something far larger. He called it the unconscious, not subconscious. That word implies something just below the surface, easy to reach. The unconscious is deeper than that. It is the part of you that holds everything you cannot afford to know. Memories too painful to remember. Desires too shameful to admit. Fears too overwhelming to face. And here is the part that unsettled people. The unconscious is not passive. It is not a forgotten attic where old memories gather dust. It is active, alive, constantly trying to communicate. Freud compared it to a pressure system. The unconscious pushes upward, consciousness pushes back. And in that struggle, that constant negotiation between what you can let yourself know and what you must keep hidden, your entire inner life takes shape. Think of it this way. Imagine you are standing at the edge of a lake. The surface is calm, clear. You can see your reflection, but beneath the surface, there are currents, rocks, depths you cannot see. And sometimes something from the depths rises. A memory, a feeling, a dream. It breaks the surface for a moment, and then it sinks again. That is repression. The mind's way of saying, not now, not safe, not yet. Freud did not invent the idea of the unconscious. Philosophers had been discussing it for centuries. But he was the first to make it central to understanding human suffering. He was the first to say, your symptoms are not random. They are messages. Your anxiety is not a malfunction. It is a signal. Your sleeplessness is not just insomnia. It is the mind trying to finish something your waking life will not let it process. And here is what made his work revolutionary. He believed you could trace those signals back to their source. That if you listened carefully enough to dreams, to slips, to the things people avoided saying, you could map the unconscious. You could find the buried memory. And once you found it, once you brought it into the light, the symptom would lose its power. This was psychoanalysis, not a treatment, a method of listening. Of course, it was never that simple. The mind does not give up its secrets easily. It has defenses, layers, tricks, and repression. The act of burying a memory is just the beginning. Because what you bury does not stay buried. It returns. And when it returns, it wears a disguise. Chapter 3, What Repression Really Is. Repression is not forgetting. Forgetting is passive. You lose the memory because it was not important. It fades naturally. Repression is active. It is the mind taking something that matters deeply, something painful, shameful, unbearable, and pushing it out of awareness. Not because it does not matter, because it matters too much. Freud described repression as a psychic act, a decision made by the mind to protect itself, not a conscious decision. You do not wake up one morning and think, I will now repress this memory. It happens automatically, instantly. Often in childhood, when the mind is still learning what is safe to feel and what is too dangerous. Here is an example. A child feels rage toward a parent, a deep, burning rage. But the child also depends on that parent for survival, for love, for safety." Unquote. So the rage becomes unbearable. It threatens the bond. It threatens everything. And the mind says, "This feeling is too dangerous. I cannot hold it." So it buries the rage. The child grows up. The rage is gone from conscious awareness. The adult does not remember it. But it is not gone. It lives in the unconscious. And from there, it speaks. Maybe as tension in the jaw. Maybe as unexplained anger toward authority figures. Maybe as a recurring nightmare where the parent appears as a stranger. The content has changed, but the feeling remains. This is repression, and Freud believed it was the foundation of most psychological suffering, not the painful event itself, but the act of pushing it down, of refusing to let it be known. Because what you refuse to know does not disappear. It just finds another way to make itself heard. Now, let your shoulders drop for a moment. Feel the weight of your body where it rests. You do not need to solve anything right now. Just notice. Repression is not a moral failing. It is not weakness. It is the mind's way of surviving something it could not process at the time. But survival strategies that work in childhood often become prisons in adulthood. The mind keeps guarding a door that no one is trying to open anymore. And the energy it takes to keep that door closed, to keep the memory buried, is exhausting. This is why Freud said, "The unconscious never rests." It is always working, always defending, always pushing the buried thing back down. And at night, when the conscious mind finally lets go, when the defenses soften, the buried thing rises. Not as a clear memory, as a feeling, a dream, a restlessness. And you wake at 3 a.m. wondering why. But the body already knew. Chapter 4, Why the Mind Hides Truth. Why does the mind hide truth from itself? It seems counterproductive, self-defeating. Freud's answer was simple. Because some truths are unbearable. Not unbearable in an abstract way. Unbearable in the sense that they threaten the very structure of your identity. Imagine a young man who was raised to believe he is kind, gentle, incapable of cruelty. His parents told him this. His teachers rewarded him for it. His friends relied on it. His entire sense of self is built on this foundation. I am a good person. And then, one day, he does something cruel. Maybe he betrays a friend. Maybe he enjoys someone's suffering. Maybe he feels a flash of pure hatred towards someone he is supposed to love. In that moment, two truths collide. The truth of what he did and the truth of who he believes he is. And the mind cannot hold both, so it chooses. It keeps the identity, I am good, and it buries the contradiction. The cruel act is forgotten, repressed, pushed into the unconscious. The man goes on believing he is incapable of cruelty. But the repressed memory does not disappear. It lives in the basement, and from there it influences everything. Maybe he becomes overly defensive when criticized. Maybe he projects his cruelty onto others, seeing in them what he cannot see in himself. Maybe he punishes himself in ways he cannot explain. The repressed truth shapes his life from the shadows. This is why Freud said repression is not about the event itself. It is about the conflict the event creates. The gap between what happened and what you can afford to believe about yourself. And the wider that gap, the more force the mind must use to keep the truth buried. This force, this psychic energy spent on repression, Freud called resistance. And resistance, he discovered, was everywhere. In therapy, patients would suddenly forget appointments when they were getting close to a painful memory. They would change the subject, make jokes, fall silent. Not because they were being difficult, because the mind was protecting itself. The closer they got to the buried truth, the stronger the defense. Freud realized the mind does not want to heal. It wants to survive. And sometimes survival means staying broken, because brokenness, at least, is familiar. The truth might shatter everything. Chapter 5. Return of the Repressed. But here is the paradox Freud uncovered. The thing you bury always comes back. He called this the return of the repressed. And it is not optional. It is not something you can prevent through willpower or discipline. It is a law of the psyche, as reliable as gravity. What is pushed into the unconscious will find a way to return, not as itself, not in its original form, but in disguise. Freud spent years cataloging these disguises. He found repressed memories returning as dreams, slips of the tongue, forgetting a name, losing an object, phobias, obsessions, compulsions, unexplained physical pain, anger at the wrong person, love for someone who resembles a buried figure from childhood, symptoms that made no medical sense but made perfect psychological sense once you trace them back to the repressed source. He told a famous story about a woman who could not drink water. Every time she tried, she gagged. For months, no physical cause could be found. In therapy, she finally remembered. As a child, she had walked into a room and seen her nanny, a woman she despised, allowing a dog to drink from a glass. The image disgusted her, but she said nothing. She swallowed her disgust, and the disgust was repressed. Years later, it returned, not as a memory, as a symptom. She could not drink water because the repressed disgust had attached itself to the act of drinking. Once she remembered the scene, once she allowed herself to feel the disgust consciously, the symptom disappeared. This is the return of the repressed. The buried feeling finds a new form, a new channel, and it will keep finding new forms until you finally let yourself see it. Think about your own life for a moment. Are there reactions that surprise you? Feelings that seem too strong for the situation? A small criticism that feels like an attack? A minor rejection that feels like abandonment? Freud would ask, what is this feeling attached to? Not the present moment. Something older, something buried. The present moment is just the trigger. The feeling itself comes from the basement. This is why he said, you are not reacting to what is happening now. You are reacting to what happened then. The past is alive in you, unfinished, waiting, and it will keep returning until you let it complete itself. Chapter 6, Symptoms as Secret Messages. Freud believed symptoms were not enemies. They were messages, coded, distorted, but messages nonetheless. Every symptom, he said, has meaning. It is the mind's way of expressing what it cannot say directly. Take anxiety. On the surface, anxiety feels pointless, irrational, a malfunction of the nervous system. But Freud saw it differently. Anxiety, he said, is a signal. It warns you that something repressed is trying to surface. It says, danger. A buried memory is close. Defenses are weakening, and the anxiety serves a purpose. It keeps you from getting too close to the memory. It distracts you, focuses your attention on the present threat, the racing heart, the shallow breath, so you do not have to face the real threat, the truth you buried. This is why panic attacks often have no clear trigger in the present. The trigger is in the past, and the panic is the mind's way of saying, do not go there, or take obsessive thoughts. The man who cannot stop checking the door, the woman who counts every step, the person who replays a conversation 100 times. On the surface, these seem like malfunctions, loops the mind gets stuck in, but Freud saw them as disguised wishes or fears. The man checking the door is not really checking the door. He is trying to control something that feels out of control. The compulsion is a substitute, a ritual that gives him the illusion of safety. But what is he really afraid of? What did he lose control of once, long ago, that he can never quite forget. The symptom knows. The conscious mind does not. Freud spent hours listening to these symptoms, tracing them back. He treated each one as a puzzle, a code to be cracked. And often, once the code was cracked, once the buried memory was brought into awareness, the symptom would dissolve. Not always, not perfectly, but often enough to prove his point. The symptom was not the problem. It was the solution the mind had found when the real problem could not be faced. So, what are your symptoms saying? What are the patterns you repeat, the fears that return, the feelings that seem too large for their cause? Freud would say, listen to them, not to judge yourself, not to diagnose yourself, just to notice, because the symptom is trying to tell you something. And the first step toward healing is hearing the message. Chapter 7. Compromise Formation Explained. Here is where Freud's thinking gets subtle. He realized that most symptoms are not just repression, they are compromises. A compromise between two forces, the repressed wish and the defense against it. He called this compromise formation, and it explains why symptoms feel so strange, so irrational, because they are trying to satisfy two opposite demands at the same time. Let me give you an example. A woman has a repressed desire to leave her marriage, but she cannot admit this to herself. The thought is too painful, too shameful, too threatening to her identity as a loyal wife. So the desire is repressed, but it does not disappear. Instead, it returns as a symptom. She develops severe migraines every time her husband comes home. The migraine is a compromise. On one hand, it expresses the repressed wish. It says, I do not want to be near him. On the other hand, it protects her from the wish. She does not have to leave. She is just sick. The symptom allows her to avoid her husband without admitting she wants to avoid him. It satisfies the wish and the defense at the same time. This is why symptoms are so resistant to change. They are not mistakes, they are solutions. Imperfect solutions, painful solutions, but solutions nonetheless. And if you take away the symptom without addressing the underlying conflict, the conflict will just create a new symptom. Freud saw this again and again. A patient would overcome one symptom only to develop another. The migraine would go away, and a rash would appear. The rash would go away, and insomnia would begin. Because the repressed wish was still there, the conflict was still unresolved, and the mind, in its strange wisdom, kept finding new ways to express what could not be said. Now, notice your breath for a moment. Let it move the way it wants to move. You do not need to change it. Just let it be. Compromise formation is not something to fix. It is something to understand. Because once you see the compromise, once you see the two forces at war inside you, you can begin to ask, what would it take to resolve this conflict? Not to repress it more deeply, but to bring it into the open, to let the wish be known, to see if it is as dangerous as you once believed. Most of the time, Freud found it is not. The wish was dangerous when you were 5, when you were 12, when you were powerless. But you are not powerless anymore. And the wish that terrified you then might simply be a feeling. One you can hold, one you can examine, one you can choose what to do with, or one you can simply let pass through. Because not every wish needs to be acted on. Some just need to be seen. Chapter 8. Anxiety as warning signal. Freud revised his theory of anxiety several times. In his early work, he thought anxiety was just repressed libido, sexual energy, with nowhere to go. Later, he realized it was more complex. Anxiety, he came to believe, is a signal, not the thing itself, but a warning that the thing is approaching. Think of it like a smoke alarm. The alarm is not the fire, it is the signal that fire is near. And anxiety, Freud said, is the ego's alarm system. It goes off when a repressed memory or wish is getting too close to consciousness. The alarm says, danger, defenses weakening, retreat. And in response, the mind activates stronger defenses, deeper repression, more elaborate symptoms, all to keep the buried thing buried. This is why anxiety often feels so irrational. You are sitting in a safe room, nothing is happening, and suddenly your heart is racing. And from the outside, it makes no sense. But from the inside, from the perspective of the unconscious, it makes perfect sense. Something is trying to surface, a memory, a feeling, a truth. And the anxiety is the mind's way of saying, stop, do not go there. Freud called this signal anxiety, and he distinguished it from another kind, traumatic anxiety. Signal anxiety happens before the danger. It warns you in advance. Traumatic anxiety happens during or after. It is the overwhelming flood when the defenses fail, when the repressed memory breaks through. Most people live in signal anxiety, a constant low hum of unease, a tightness in the chest, a vigilance that never rests. They are not in danger, but the mind believes they are, because somewhere in the basement a door is rattling, and the mind is terrified of what might come through. Freud believed the only way to resolve this kind of anxiety was to stop running from what is behind the door, not to fling it open recklessly. That can cause traumatic flooding, but to approach it slowly, carefully, with support, to see what is there, to name it, to let it into the light. And often what is there is not as dangerous as the mind believed. It is just a feeling, a memory, a truth, one that was once unbearable, but might now simply be sad, or painful, or even relieving. Because sometimes the hardest part is not the truth itself. It is the energy it takes to keep running from it. Chapter 9, Defenses Beyond Repression. Repression was just the beginning. As Freud studied his patients, he realized the mind had many ways to protect itself. He called these defense mechanisms, and his daughter, Anna Freud, later catalogued dozens of them, each one a different strategy for managing unbearable feelings. Denial is the simplest. The mind refuses to acknowledge reality. It is not happening. It did not happen. It will not happen. This works until reality becomes impossible to ignore. Projection is subtler. You take a feeling you cannot accept in yourself and see it in someone else. The man who cannot admit his own anger becomes convinced everyone around him is angry. The woman who cannot face her own jealousy sees jealousy everywhere she looks. The feeling is real, but it is displaced, projected outward. This protects the self-image, but it distorts relationships. Displacement moves the feeling from a dangerous target to a safe one. You cannot yell at your boss, so you yell at your spouse. You cannot admit rage toward your father, so you feel inexplicable anger toward all authority figures. The emotion is real, but it is aimed at the wrong person. Rationalization is the mind's favorite trick. You take an uncomfortable truth and wrap it in a logical explanation that makes it acceptable. I do not avoid socializing because I am afraid of rejection. I avoid it because people are shallow. I do not stay in this job because I am afraid of change. I stay because the benefits are good. The explanation feels true, but it is a cover story. Beneath it, the repressed fear remains. Sublimation is Freud's favorite defense. It transforms a socially unacceptable impulse into something creative or productive. Sexual desire becomes art. Aggression becomes competitive sports. Grief becomes poetry. This is the healthiest defense, Freud said, because the energy is not buried, it is redirected. The feeling is allowed, just in a different form, and then there is reaction formation. This is when you feel something so strongly that you do the exact opposite. The man who is terrified of his own homosexual desires becomes aggressively homophobic. The parent who resents their child becomes overprotective, smothering. The person who fears their own cruelty becomes excessively kind, people-pleasing, self-sacrificing. The defense is so complete that the original feeling is invisible, but it is there. In the extremity of the reaction, Freud believed we all use these defenses. They are not pathological. They are human. The question is not, do you defend yourself? The question is, how flexible are your defenses? Can you let them down when it is safe? Or have they become so rigid that you can no longer feel anything real? Because the cost of constant defense is numbness. You protect yourself from pain, but you also cut yourself off from joy, from connection, from the full range of being alive. And sometimes the bravest thing is not building a stronger defense. It is letting one go. Chapter 10, Dreamwork, Wish Fulfillment. Now we arrive at dreams. For Freud, dreams were not random noise. They were the royal road to the unconscious. Every dream, he believed, is a wish fulfillment. Not always obvious, not always pleasant. But beneath the surface, every dream is the mind satisfying a desire it cannot satisfy in waking life. This sounds strange at first. What about nightmares? What about dreams where you fail, where you are chased, where you lose everything? How can those be wish fulfillments? Freud's answer: the wish is disguised. The dream presents the wish in a way that the conscious mind can tolerate. Let me give you an example. A man dreams his father has died. He wakes in distress. On the surface, this is not a wish. It is a nightmare. But Freud would ask, what is the latent wish beneath the manifest content? Maybe, as a child, the man wished his father would disappear so his mother would pay attention to him. The wish was repressed, buried, unbearable. But in the dream, it returns. The father is gone, and the distress the man feels upon waking is not just grief, it is guilt. Guilt for the wish he once had, the wish he has never admitted. This is dreamwork, the process by which the unconscious takes a repressed wish and transforms it into a dream that the conscious mind can accept. The transformation is necessary because the wish in its raw form would be too disturbing. It would wake you, shatter the sleep. So the dream disguises it, and the disguise has rules. Freud called these the mechanisms of dreamwork, and understanding them, he said, is the key to interpreting dreams. Chapter 11, Manifest versus Latent Dreams. Freud made a critical distinction. The manifest content of a dream is what you remember, the images, the storyline, the surface. The latent content is the hidden meaning, the repressed wish, the underlying conflict. Most people only remember the manifest content. And when they try to interpret the dream, they interpret the surface. But Freud said the surface is a distortion. It is designed to hide the latent content, not reveal it. So interpretation is not about what the dream shows. It is about what the dream is hiding. And to find what is hidden, you must undo the dream work. You must reverse the process by which the latent content was transformed into the manifest content. This is not guessing. It is not free association in the wild. It is careful, systematic analysis. Freud would ask his patients to take each element of the dream, a person, an object, a setting, and say everything that came to mind. No censoring, no judging, just speaking. And in those associations, the hidden meaning would begin to emerge. A staircase in a dream might remind the patient of childhood. Childhood might remind them of a specific fear. The fear might connect to a repressed memory. Slowly, the latent content reveals itself, not as a symbol with a fixed meaning. Freud was skeptical of dream dictionaries, but as a personal, individual meaning unique to the dreamer's life. The manifest dream is the puzzle. The latent content is the solution. And the dreamwork is the process that turned the solution into the puzzle. Freud identified several mechanisms of dreamwork. The two most important were condensation and displacement. And together they explain why dreams feel so strange, so dense, so hard to interpret. Chapter 12. Condensation. Many into one. Condensation is the process by which multiple ideas, memories, or wishes are compressed into a single dream image. One person in your dream might represent 3 different people from your life. One object might carry the emotional weight of a dozen memories. This is why dreams feel so layered, so overdetermined, because each element is doing multiple jobs at once. Freud gave the example of a patient who dreamed of a botanical monograph. On the surface, it made no sense. The man had no interest in botany, but through free association, the image began to unpack. The monograph reminded him of a book he had written. The book reminded him of a professor who had criticized it. The criticism reminded him of his father. His father reminded him of a childhood memory where he had torn pages from a book. The single image, botanical monograph, condensed all of these associations into one symbol. The dream was not about botany. It was about guilt, criticism, defiance, and the father, all compressed into one image. This is condensation, and it is why a single dream, when fully analyzed, can take hours to unpack. Because every element is a node, a meeting point of multiple unconscious threads. Freud believed condensation served a purpose. It allowed the mind to express many repressed wishes at once without overwhelming consciousness. It is efficient, economic, but it also makes dreams nearly impossible to understand without analysis, because the meaning is not on the surface. It is in the layers beneath. Chapter 13. Displacement. Shifting the threat. Displacement is the second major mechanism of dreamwork. It moves the emotional intensity from its true object to a safer one. You are furious at your boss, but in the dream, you are furious at a stranger. You are terrified of your own death, but in the dream, someone else dies. The feeling is real, but the target has been displaced. This protects you from the full force of the repressed emotion, because if the dream showed the true object of your fury or fear, it would wake you The defense would fail. The repression would break. So the dream shifts the charge. It places the emotion on something less threatening. And you wake remembering the stranger, the random death, the inexplicable anger, but you do not remember the real source. Freud saw displacement everywhere, in phobias, in slips of the tongue, in symptoms. A child is afraid of his father, but develops a phobia of dogs. The fear is real, but it has been displaced onto a safer object. A woman cannot express anger toward her mother, so she becomes irrationally angry at her daughter. The anger is real, but the target has shifted. Displacement allows the feeling to exist without threatening the primary relationship. But it also creates confusion, because the conscious mind does not understand why it feels this way about this person or this object. The connection has been severed, and only by tracing it back through free association, through careful analysis, can the original source be found. Let your jaw soften for a moment. Notice the stillness around you. You are safe here. The dream is just a story the mind tells itself. And the story, strange as it is trying to protect you, trying to let you feel without breaking, trying to say what cannot be said directly. Chapter 14, Censorship and Dream Distortion. Freud believed there was a censor inside the mind, a force that monitored what could and could not enter consciousness. During waking life, the censor is strict. Repressed wishes are kept firmly in the unconscious, but during sleep, the censor relaxes. Not completely, just enough, and repressed wishes begin to rise. But even in sleep, the censor does not disappear entirely. It is still there, watching, editing, and if a wish tries to surface in its raw form, the censor distorts it. This is dream distortion, the process by which the latent content is transformed into the manifest content. The wish is allowed to appear, but only in disguise. This is why dreams are so bizarre, why they make no logical sense, why the narrative jumps, the characters shift, the setting dissolves. Because the dream is not trying to make sense. It is trying to satisfy a wish while evading the censor. Freud compared it to a coded message sent through enemy territory. The message has to reach its destination, but it cannot be sent in plain language. So it is encrypted, scrambled, disguised, and only the intended recipient, the unconscious mind, can decode it. The conscious mind wakes up with fragments, images, a vague sense of unease, but the meaning remains hidden, and this is by design, because if the meaning were obvious, the censor would wake you. The repression would fail, and you would be flooded with feelings you are not ready to hold. This is why Freud said, you cannot simply interpret a dream by looking at it. You must undo the distortion. You must reverse the censorship, and that requires time, patience, and willingness to see what you have been avoiding. Chapter 15. Day Residue and Triggers. Freud noticed something curious. Most dreams contain elements from the previous day. A face you saw, a conversation you had, a thought that passed briefly through your mind. He called this day residue, and he believed it served a specific function. The unconscious wish, the repressed desire, cannot appear directly in the dream, but it can attach itself to something recent, something neutral, something from the day. This is the trigger. The day residue provides the disguise. So a passing comment at work becomes the setting for a dream about childhood. A stranger's face becomes the face of your father. A minor frustration becomes the stage for a repressed rage. The unconscious uses the day's leftovers to build the dream. And this is why dreams often feel so random. Because the surface content, the day residue, has no intrinsic meaning. It is just the material the unconscious had to work with. The meaning is in what the unconscious attached to that material. Freud would ask, why this image? Why this person? Why now? And often the answer was not in the image itself. It was in the association. The patient saw a stranger on the train. The stranger had a moustache. The moustache reminded them of their father. And suddenly, the dream that night was about the father. Not explicitly, but symbolically. The stranger became the vehicle for the repressed feeling. This is why dream interpretation is not about symbols. It is about personal history. The same image can mean different things to different people. A dog in your dream might mean loyalty, or fear, or childhood, or nothing. It depends on your associations, your memories, your buried conflicts, and only you can trace those connections. The dream gives you the thread, but you have to follow it. Chapter 16. Screen, Memories, and Substitution. Freud discovered that some memories are not memories at all. They are screens, covers for something deeper. He called them screen memories. A patient remembers a childhood scene vividly, in great detail. But when Freud examines the memory, it becomes clear the scene is not important. It is covering something else, something more painful. A man remembers picking flowers in a field as a child. It is a pleasant memory, innocent. But through analysis, Freud discovers the man picked those flowers the day his mother left. The memory of the flowers is real, but it is a screen for the unbearable memory of the loss. The mind preserved the flowers and buried the abandonment. This is substitution. One memory stands in for another. The substitute is safe, neutral, sometimes even pleasant, but it blocks access to the real memory. And as long as the screen remains, the real memory stays hidden. Freud believed many childhood memories were screens, that we remember the trivial and forget the traumatic. Not because the trauma was insignificant, because it was too significant and the mind needed to hide it. So it created a substitute, a benign image, a neutral scene, and we carry that image forward, believing it is the whole story. But it is not the whole story. It is the cover. And beneath the cover, the real memory waits. Chapter 17, Childhood Roots of Conflict. Freud believed most psychological conflict begins in childhood, not because childhood is inherently traumatic, but because childhood is when the mind is most vulnerable. A child does not have the capacity to process overwhelming emotion. So when something unbearable happens, a loss, a betrayal, a terror, the child's mind does what it must. It represses, and that repression shapes everything that follows. The adult does not remember the event, but the adult carries the feeling, and the feeling influences their relationships, their choices, their symptoms. Freud was particularly interested in the conflicts between desire and prohibition. The child wants something, the parent forbids it. The child feels rage. But rage toward the parent is too dangerous. It threatens the bond, so the rage is repressed. And years later, the adult finds themselves inexplicably angry at authority, at partners, at themselves. The original conflict was never resolved. It was just pushed underground, and it keeps replaying in different forms, with different people, but the structure is the same. This is why Freud said the neurotic suffers from reminiscences, not conscious memories, but patterns, feelings, reactions. The past is alive in the present, and until the past is brought into awareness, it will continue to control the present. Freud did not believe this was deterministic. He did not believe you were doomed to repeat your childhood forever, but he did believe that change required awareness. You had to see the pattern, name it, trace it back to its origin, and once you saw it clearly, you had a choice. You could keep replaying it, or you could let it go. Chapter 18, Oedipal Tensions and Desire. Freud's most controversial idea was the Oedipus complex. The idea that every child experiences sexual desire for the opposite sex parent and rivalry with the same-sex parent. This idea was, and remains, deeply unsettling. Many have rejected it outright. But Freud did not mean sexual desire in the adult sense. He meant attachment, possession, the child's total claim on the parent's love, and the terror that someone else, the other parent, a sibling, might take that love away. This is not conscious. The child does not think, I want to marry my mother and kill my father, but the feeling is there. The pull toward one parent, the resentment toward the other, and the guilt that follows. Because the child also loves the rival parent, depends on them, so the desire becomes unbearable, and it is repressed. Freud believed this conflict, this triangular tension was universal, and that how the child resolved it shaped their future relationships. If the conflict was repressed too harshly, the adult might never be able to love freely. If it was resolved too loosely, the adult might remain forever seeking the parent in every partner. The healthy resolution, Freud said, was identification. The child lets go of the parent as a love object and identifies with the same-sex parent instead. The boy becomes like the father. The girl becomes like the mother. And in that identification, the desire is transformed. But Freud knew this resolution was never perfect. Everyone carries some residue of the Oedipal conflict, some unresolved longing, some buried guilt. And it surfaces in adulthood, in partner choice, in sexual inhibition, in the feeling that love and guilt are inseparable. You do not have to accept Freud's theory to notice the pattern. Notice how many people choose partners who resemble a parent. Notice how often love feels forbidden, dangerous, too close to something shameful. Freud would say, this is the Oedipal residue, the buried desire, the unfinished conflict, and it will keep surfacing until you see it clearly. Chapter 19, Trauma and Delayed Meaning. Freud revised his understanding of trauma many times. In his early work, he believed all neurosis came from childhood sexual abuse. Later, he realized it was more complex. Some patients had been abused, others had not. But all of them carried the memory of something overwhelming, something the child could not process at the time. And here is what Freud discovered. Trauma often has no meaning in the moment. The child experiences something, a look, a touch, a word. It is strange, uncomfortable, but not yet traumatic. The child forgets it. Years later, in adolescence or adulthood, something triggers the memory, and suddenly the memory is reinterpreted, given new meaning. And that new meaning is traumatic. Freud called this Nachträglichkeit, afterwardness. The idea that trauma is not always immediate. Sometimes it is delayed. The event happens in childhood, but the trauma happens later when the mind finally understands what the event meant. This explained why some patients could not remember the traumatic event, because at the time it was not traumatic. It only became traumatic in retrospect, and the retroactive trauma was repressed, buried, hidden, but it shaped everything. Freud saw this in cases of sexual trauma especially. A child experiences something sexual before they understand sexuality. It is confusing, strange, but not overwhelming. Then, in adolescence, the child learns what sex means, and the memory returns with new meaning. And the new meaning is unbearable, so it is repressed. But the repression is incomplete because the memory has already left its mark in anxiety, in symptoms, in a fear of intimacy the adult cannot explain. This is why Freud said, The past is never past. It is constantly being rewritten by the present, and the present is constantly haunted by the past. Chapter 20. Repetition, Compulsion at Work. Freud noticed something strange. People repeat the same patterns over and over. The woman who was neglected as a child marries a neglectful partner. The man who was criticized by his father finds himself in jobs where he is constantly criticized. The person who suffered abandonment keeps ending up in relationships that end in abandonment. On the surface, this makes no sense. Why would someone repeat what hurt them? Freud's answer: because the unconscious is trying to master the trauma. By repeating it, the mind hopes to finally gain control, to finish what was left unfinished, to resolve what could not be resolved the first time. He called this repetition compulsion, and he believed it was one of the most powerful forces in human behavior. It is not conscious. You do not wake up and think, "Today I will recreate my childhood wound." But the pattern repeats, because the unconscious is still trying to solve the original problem. The child who was abandoned is still trying to make the parent stay, but the parent is gone. So the adult recreates the situation with a new person, hoping unconsciously for a different outcome, hoping to finally feel safe, loved, chosen. But the pattern is too strong, and the outcome is always the same. Freud saw this in therapy too. Patients would recreate their childhood conflicts with the therapist. The abandoned child would fear the therapist would abandon them. The criticized child would expect the therapist to criticize them. This was transference, and it was both the problem and the solution. The problem: the patient could not see the therapist clearly. They saw the parent. The solution: once the pattern was visible, it could be worked through. The repetition compulsion could be interrupted, and the patient could finally choose a different ending. But this required awareness. You had to see the pattern, name it, understand where it came from, and that was terrifying. Because seeing the pattern meant admitting you had been replaying the same scene for decades, that you had chosen unconsciously the very thing you were trying to escape. But Freud believed this awareness was the only path to freedom, because as long as the pattern remained unconscious, it would repeat forever. Chapter 21. The Uncanny Familiar Feeling. Freud wrote a famous essay about the uncanny, the strange feeling you get when something is both familiar and foreign at the same time. A house you have never been in that feels like home. A face you have never seen that looks like someone you know. A dream that feels more real than waking life. The uncanny, Freud said, is the return of the repressed. It is the feeling you get when something buried rises to the surface. Not fully, just enough to create dissonance. You recognize it, but you do not know why. it is familiar. But it should not be. This is why repressed memories often feel uncanny when they return. They do not feel like your memories. They feel like someone else's, or like a story you heard once, a movie you saw, anything but yours. Because to claim them as yours would be unbearable. So the mind keeps them at a distance, familiar enough to haunt you, foreign enough to deny. Freud believed the uncanny was a signal, a sign that something repressed was close to consciousness, and that if you followed the feeling instead of running from it, you would find the buried memory. Think about moments in your own life that felt uncanny, a sense of déjà vu, a place that felt haunted, a person who unsettled you in a way you could not name. Freud would ask, "What is this reminding you of?" Not consciously, but unconsciously. What memory is trying to surface? What feeling is trying to be known? The uncanny is not random. It is a clue, and if you are brave enough to follow it, it will lead you somewhere. Chapter 22. Slips, Errors, Forgetting Names. Freud believed there were no accidents. Every slip of the tongue, every forgotten name, every lost object, these were not random, they were meaningful. He called them parapraxes, but we know them as Freudian slips, and they are the unconscious leaking through. You mean to say one thing, another word comes out. You call your partner by your ex's name. You forget the name of someone you dislike. You lose the keys on the day you do not want to go somewhere. On the surface, these seem like mistakes, but Freud would say, look closer. What did you really mean to say? What were you really trying to do? Often, the slip reveals the repressed truth. The word that came out is the word you were trying not to say. The name you forgot is the name you were trying to avoid. The lost object is the task you were unconsciously resisting. Freud collected hundreds of examples. A man says he is going to insert a fact into a conversation when he meant to say illustrate. Freud asks, why insert? What does that word mean to you? And the man realizes insert is a sexual word, and the fact he is about to share is sexual in nature, embarrassing. His unconscious tried to censor it, but it leaked through in the word choice. This is the power of the unconscious. It speaks even when you are trying to silence it, and the more you repress, the more it finds sideways routes to expression. Notice your own slips, the names you forget, the words that come out wrong, the objects that vanish when you need them most. Freud would say, these are not accidents, they are communications. From the part of you that knows what you will not let yourself know. Chapter 23. Jokes, Wit, Psychic Release. Freud wrote an entire book about jokes, not because he thought they were trivial, but because he saw in them the same mechanisms as dreams. Jokes, he believed, are a way to express what cannot be said directly. a hostile thought, a sexual idea, a taboo wish. You cannot say it plainly. That would be offensive, inappropriate. So you disguise it as humor, and suddenly it is acceptable. The hostile thought becomes a punchline. The sexual idea becomes innuendo, and everyone laughs. But Freud would ask, what is the laughter releasing? Not just amusement, tension, psychic energy that was being used to repress the thought. The joke allows the thought to surface briefly, safely, and the repression relaxes. The laughter is the release of that energy. This is why jokes about sex and aggression are so common, because those are the two drives most heavily repressed, and the joke is a socially acceptable way to let them out. Freud believed the best jokes were the ones that revealed the most, the ones that let you say what you really think without consequences. And the laughter was not just enjoyment, it was relief. Relief that the forbidden thought could be spoken, that the repressed wish could, for a moment, exist in the open. This is also why some jokes make you uncomfortable, because they get too close. They reveal too much, and instead of laughter, you feel anxiety. The defense snaps back into place, and the joke is not funny anymore. Freud saw jokes as a window into the unconscious, a way to see what people were repressing, and if you listen carefully to the joke someone tells, you can often hear what they cannot say directly. Chapter 24, Libido and Psychic Economy. Freud believed the mind operated on energy. He called it libido, not just sexual energy. Though sexuality was central, but psychic energy, life energy, the force that drives all mental activity. And this energy, Freud said, had to go somewhere. If it could not be expressed directly, it would be redirected, sublimated, repressed, displaced, but it would not disappear. This was the economic model of the mind. Energy in, energy out. And if the energy was blocked, if repression was too strong, it would build up, like pressure in a closed system. And eventually, it would find a release, often in the form of a symptom, a physical pain, a compulsion, a phobia. The symptom was the release valve. It allowed the energy to escape without the repressed content becoming conscious. This is why Freud was so interested in sexual repression. He believed sexual energy was the most powerful. And when it was blocked through guilt, shame, prohibition, it created the most symptoms. Hysteria, obsessions, anxiety, all were, in Freud's view, forms of dammed-up libido. The energy had nowhere to go, so it turned against the self. Freud's solution was not to unleash the energy recklessly, but to find a healthy outlet, sublimation, creative work, relationships where desire could be expressed safely. The energy had to flow, and when it flowed, the symptoms often resolved. This economic model has been criticized, simplified, sometimes dismissed. But the core idea remains. Repression is costly. It takes energy to keep something buried, and that energy is not available for living. So the more you repress, the less alive you feel. And the path to vitality is not adding more, it is releasing what you have been holding. Chapter 25: Narcissism and Self-Protection. Freud distinguished between two kinds of love. Object love, loving someone else, and narcissistic love, loving yourself. Both are necessary, both are healthy in balance. But when narcissism becomes extreme, it is a defense, a way to protect the self from the pain of needing others. Freud believed infants are naturally narcissistic. They experience themselves as the center of the universe. Their needs matter. The world revolves around them, and this is healthy. For a time, but as the child grows, they must learn to love others, to recognize that others have needs, feelings, inner lives. This is object love, and it requires giving up some of the narcissistic omnipotence. But for some people, that loss is too painful. Maybe the parent was unreliable. Maybe the world felt unsafe. So the child clings to narcissism, not consciously, but as a defense. If I do not need anyone, I cannot be hurt by anyone. If I am perfect, I cannot be rejected. If I am the center, I cannot be abandoned. This is narcissistic self-protection, and Freud saw it in many of his patients. Not as arrogance, as fragility, a brittle shell built around a wounded self. The narcissist cannot tolerate criticism, cannot admit fault, cannot see themselves clearly. Because to see themselves clearly would be to see the wound, and the wound is unbearable. So they inflate the self, make it invulnerable, untouchable, but the cost is enormous, because narcissistic love is lonely. It cannot connect, cannot be intimate, cannot truly see another person, because seeing another person would require seeing the self, and the self is the thing they are most desperately avoiding. Freud believed narcissism could be worked through, but it required the person to feel safe enough to be vulnerable, to let the shell crack, to admit need, to admit imperfection. And that required a relationship where they would not be shamed for being human, where the wound could be seen and held without judgment. Only then could the narcissism soften and object love become possible. Chapter 26: Id, Ego, Superego Dynamics. In his later work, Freud revised his model of the mind. He introduced three structures: id, ego, superego. The id is pure drive, hunger, desire, rage, lust. It wants what it wants, immediately, without compromise. It is the child screaming for milk. The impulse to strike, the urge that knows no morality. The id operates on the pleasure principle. If it feels good, do it. If it hurts, avoid it. Simple, primal, amoral. The superego is the opposite. It is the internalized voice of the parent, society, morality. It tells you what you should do, what is right, what is shameful. It is the judge, the critic, the conscience, and it is often harsh. Because it was formed in childhood when moral rules were absolute and punishment was terrifying, so the superego is rigid, unforgiving. It demands perfection and punishes failure with guilt. The ego is caught between them. It is the mediator, the adult, the part of you that tries to satisfy both the id and the superego while navigating reality. The id wants to scream at your boss. The superego says you should never be angry. The ego finds a compromise. Maybe you write a passive-aggressive email. Maybe you vent to a friend. Maybe you repress the anger and develop a headache. The ego is always negotiating, and it is exhausting, because the id is relentless, and the superego is unforgiving, and reality is full of obstacles. Freud believed most psychological suffering came from this internal conflict. The id wanting what the superego forbids, and the ego, overwhelmed, resorting to defense mechanisms to keep the peace. The goal of therapy, Freud said, was not to eliminate the id or the superego, but to strengthen the ego, to help the person mediate more flexibly, to find compromises that allowed desire without shame, to satisfy the superego without crushing the id, to live in reality without constant repression. This required self-knowledge, understanding what the id wanted, what the superego demanded, and why. What, and then choosing consciously how to respond. Not perfectly, not always, but with more freedom, more agency, more awareness. Chapter 27. Guilt and the Inner Judge. Freud believed guilt was the superego's weapon, the way it enforced its rules. When you violate the superego's standards, when you feel a forbidden desire, think a shameful thought, act on an impulse, guilt follows. Not as punishment from the outside, as punishment from within. The superego attacks the ego, and the ego feels it as guilt, shame, self-loathing. Freud distinguished between realistic guilt and neurotic guilt. Realistic guilt is when you have actually harmed someone. You lied, you betrayed, you hurt. The guilt is proportional, and it can be resolved through repair. Apologize, make amends, change the behavior. Neurotic guilt is different. It is guilt for desires you never acted on, thoughts you never spoke, impulses you repressed before they could even surface. The superego punishes you for what you wanted to do, not what you did. And this guilt is relentless, because there is nothing to repair, no amends, to make. You are guilty for existing, for feeling, for being human. Freud saw neurotic guilt in almost all his patients. The man who felt guilty for resenting his father, even though he had never said a word. The woman who felt guilty for not loving her child enough, even though she was a devoted mother. The guilt was not about action, it was about feeling. And feelings, in the superego's view, were as dangerous as actions. Maybe more dangerous, because actions could be controlled. Feelings could not. So the superego policed every thought, every desire, and found something to punish. Freud believed the only way to resolve neurotic guilt was to understand where the superego came from, whose voice it was, what it was protecting. Often, the superego was the internalized parent, the father who demanded perfection, the mother who shamed emotion. And once the patient saw this, they could begin to question it. Do I still need this voice? Is it protecting me or just punishing me? And sometimes the answer was, it is just punishing me, and the person could choose slowly to soften the superego, to speak to themselves with more compassion, to forgive themselves for being human. Chapter 28, Melancholia, Loss, Self-Attack. Freud wrote one of his most haunting essays about mourning and melancholia. Mourning, he said, is when you lose someone and grieve them clearly. You know who you lost, you feel the loss, you cry, you remember, and over time, the grief softens. You do not forget the person, but you learn to live without them. Melancholia is different. In melancholia, you have lost something, but you do not know what. Maybe the person is still alive. Maybe the loss was symbolic, a dream, an identity, a version of yourself. But the grief is there, heavy, persistent, and it turns inward. In mourning, you grieve the other. In melancholia, you attack yourself. Freud believed this was because of ambivalence. You loved the lost person, but you also hated them. And when they left, the love had nowhere to go. But the hate also had nowhere to go. So the hate turned inward. You became the target of your own rage. This is why melancholia feels like self-loathing, like you are worthless, defective, undeserving of love. And it is not really about you. It is about the person you lost, the anger you could not express toward them because they were gone, or because you still needed them, or because the anger itself was too shameful. So you swallowed it, and it became melancholia. Freud saw this in depression, in suicidal thoughts, in the person who cannot stop punishing themselves. They are not really punishing themselves. They are punishing the lost object, the parent who abandoned them, the lover who left, the self they once were. But because the object is gone, the punishment lands on the ego, and the ego becomes the scapegoat. Freud believed melancholia could be resolved, but it required mourning the actual loss, not the symbolic one, the real one, the person, the relationship, the part of yourself you lost. And once you could grieve clearly, the self-attack would stop, because the anger would have its true target, and it would pass through. Instead of circling endlessly inward, Chapter 29, Obsessions and Mental Rituals. Freud spent years studying obsessional neurosis. The patient who could not stop checking the stove, the person who counted every step, the mind that replayed the same thought 1,000 times. On the surface, these seemed like errors of logic. The rational mind knows the stove is off, the door is locked, the hands are clean, but the obsessive mind does not care. It needs to check again and again. Freud asked, "What is the obsession protecting you from?" And he found it is protecting you from a repressed impulse, often an aggressive or sexual impulse. The man who checks the stove obsessively might have a repressed wish to burn the house down. The woman who washes her hands compulsively might have a repressed fear of contamination, not physical, but moral. The obsession is a defense. It says, "I am not dangerous. See, I am being so careful, so controlled." But the defense reveals what it is defending against. The checking reveals the repressed wish to destroy. The washing reveals the repressed sense of being dirty. The obsession is a compromise formation. It allows the impulse to exist symbolically while preventing it from being acted on. Freud believed obsessions were exhausting precisely because they were compromises. They satisfied neither the id nor the superego fully. The id wanted to act, the superego forbade it. The ego created a ritual, and the ritual had to be repeated endlessly because it never resolved the conflict. It just managed it. Freud's approach was to bring the repressed impulse into awareness, to let the patient see what they were defending against. And often, once they saw it, the impulse lost its power because it was not as dangerous as the defense suggested. It was just a feeling, a wish, one that could be acknowledged without being acted on. And once it was acknowledged, the obsession often faded, because the defense was no longer needed. Chapter 30, Phobias and Avoidant Safety. Phobias, Freud believed, were similar to obsessions. Both were defenses, both involved avoidance. But where obsessions involve rituals, phobias involve distance. The person with a phobia of heights avoids heights. The person with a phobia of dogs avoids dogs. On the surface, this seems rational. If something scares you, avoid it. But Freud asked, what are you really avoiding? And often, the answer was not the object itself, but what the object symbolized. He gave the famous example of little Hans. a 5-year-old boy who developed a phobia of horses. He could not leave the house, could not go near a horse, terrified. Freud analyzed the case and concluded the phobia was not about horses. It was about the boy's father. The boy had repressed hostility toward his father, part of the Oedipal conflict. But he could not admit that hostility. It was too dangerous. So the mind displaced it. The father became the horse, and the boy avoided horses instead of admitting he feared his father. The phobia was a compromise. It allowed the fear to exist without threatening the primary relationship. Freud saw this pattern again and again. The phobia was rarely about the object. It was about something or someone the object represented, and the avoidance protected the person from facing the real fear. But it also trapped them, because the phobia could expand. First, you avoid horses. Then you avoid the street where horses might be. Then you avoid leaving the house. The defense grows to protect the original repression, and the world shrinks. Freud believed the only way to resolve a phobia was to face the real fear. Not the horse, the father, not the height, the loss of control, not the dog, the aggression you are projecting. And once the real fear was named, the phobia often dissolved, because the object was just a stand-in, and stand-ins can be let go. Chapter 31. Hysteria and Body Conversion. Freud began his career studying hysteria. Patients, mostly women, who developed physical symptoms with no medical cause. Paralysis, blindness, seizures, pain. The body was malfunctioning, but the body was fine. Freud realized the symptoms were psychological, but not imagined, not fake, real, physical, but caused by repressed emotion. He called this conversion. The mind converts emotional conflict into physical symptom. A woman cannot speak because she has something she cannot say. A man cannot walk because he cannot move forward in his life. A woman goes blind because she witnessed something she cannot bear to see. The body speaks what the mind cannot. This is conversion hysteria, and Freud believed it was the most dramatic form of repression. The emotion is so unbearable that it leaves the psychic realm entirely. It becomes physical, and once it is physical, it can be treated as a medical problem. The person is not responsible. They are sick. This is the secondary gain of the symptom. The person gets care, attention, permission to rest. They do not have to face the unbearable emotion. The symptom does it for them. Freud's treatment was to trace the symptom back to the repressed emotion, to help the patient remember what they could not bear to feel. And once they felt it, consciously, fully, the symptom often disappeared. The paralysis lifted, the pain resolved, the blindness cleared, because the conversion was no longer needed. The emotion had been expressed. Freud saw this as proof that the unconscious and the body were not separate. They were deeply connected, and what could not be spoken would be enacted. In the body, in the symptom, in the suffering. Chapter 32. Transference, Love and Rage. Freud discovered transference by accident. He was treating patients, building rapport, listening carefully, and then suddenly the patient would fall in love with him or hate him intensely, irrationally. At first, he thought this was a problem, but then he realized this is the work. The patient was not reacting to him. They were reacting to someone else. A parent, a sibling, a lover from the past. They were transferring old feelings onto the therapist. And in that transference, the repressed relationship was being replayed. Freud saw this as an opportunity, because if the patient could experience the repressed feelings in the safety of therapy, they could finally work through them. The woman who feared her father could feel that fear with the therapist and see that the therapist did not punish her. The man who never received his mother's love could long for the therapist's approval and see that longing clearly. Transference made the unconscious visible. It brought the past into the present, and in the present it could be examined, questioned, resolved. But transference was also dangerous because the feelings were real. The patient really did fall in love, really did feel rage. And if the therapist responded as the original figure had, with rejection, with criticism, with seduction, the wound would deepen. Freud believed the therapist had to remain neutral, not cold, but clear, to reflect the feelings back without acting on them, to say, "You are feeling this, but I am not your father, I am not your mother." And in that gap between the transference and the reality, healing could happen, because the patient could see, I am reacting to a ghost, not to the person in front of me. And once they saw that, they could begin to let the ghost go. Chapter 33. Resistance. The mind pushes back. Freud expected his patients to want to heal, to want to remember, to want to face the repressed material. But what he found was the opposite. The closer they got to the buried memory, the harder they resisted. They forgot appointments, arrived late, changed the subject. They became angry at Freud, or silent, or dismissive. This was not sabotage, it was resistance. The mind protecting itself, because the repressed material was still too dangerous, and the defense was still necessary. Freud came to see resistance as the core of the therapeutic work, not an obstacle, but the work itself, because wherever there was resistance, there was something buried. The patient who could not talk about their mother was protecting a wound involving their mother. The patient who laughed off every serious moment was protecting themselves from grief. The patient who intellectualized everything was protecting themselves from feeling. Freud would point out the resistance gently. You change the subject, every time we approach this memory. You laugh when you talk about your father. You fall silent when I ask about your childhood. And often, just naming the resistance was enough to weaken it, because resistance works best in the dark. Once it is seen, it loses some of its power. The patient could choose: do I keep defending, or do I let myself see what I have been avoiding? Not always, not immediately, but over time, the resistance would soften, and the repressed material would begin to surface. Slowly, carefully, in pieces the patient could hold. Chapter 34. Working through the conflict. Freud realized that insight was not enough. You could uncover a repressed memory, name the conflict, see the pattern, and still repeat it, because knowing and changing are not the same. He called the process of change working through, and it was slow, repetitive, frustrating. The patient would gain insight, feel relief, believe they were healed, and then, weeks later, the same pattern would return. They would fall into the same relationship, make the same mistake, feel the same fear. And Freud would say, this is not failure, this is the work. Because working through means repeating the pattern consciously, noticing it, naming it, choosing differently, not once, but many times, until the new choice becomes natural, until the old pattern loses its grip. This is why therapy takes time, not because the therapist is slow, but because the mind is loyal to its defenses, its patterns, its old solutions. And breaking that loyalty requires repetition. You have to see the pattern in 10 different contexts before you truly see it. You have to choose differently 20 times before the choice feels real. You have to grieve the same loss in waves before the grief completes. Freud believed working through was where most therapies failed, because people wanted a quick fix, a single insight, a dramatic breakthrough. But real change was cumulative, small, incremental. 1,000 tiny choices to see clearly instead of defend. And over time, those choices added up. The pattern weakened, the defense softened, and the person became slowly more free. Chapter 35. Remembering versus reenacting. Freud distinguished between two ways of dealing with the past: remembering and reenacting. Remembering is conscious. You recall the event, feel the feeling, put it into words, and in remembering you gain distance. The past is past. It is over. It cannot hurt you now. Reenacting is unconscious. You do not remember the past. You repeat it in your relationships, in your choices, in your symptoms. The past is not over. It is happening again. Now, Freud saw reenactment everywhere. The woman who was betrayed as a child keeps choosing partners who betray her. She is not remembering the betrayal. She is reenacting it. The man who was criticized by his father becomes a perfectionist who criticizes himself relentlessly. He is not remembering the criticism, he is reenacting it. Reenactment is the repetition compulsion in action. The mind trying to master the trauma by repeating it. But repetition without awareness does not master anything. It just deepens the groove. Freud believed the goal of therapy was to turn reenactment into remembering, to help the patient see, you are not in the past, you are repeating the past. And once they saw that, they could choose, do I keep repeating, or do I remember? Remembering is harder because it means feeling the original pain, the abandonment, the betrayal, the terror, without the defense, without the distraction, just feeling it fully for the first time. But once it is felt, it can be let go because it is no longer unfinished. It is complete. And reenactment can finally stop. Chapter 36. Sleep, Dreams, and Insomnia. And so we return to where we began. The night, the restlessness, the mind that will not be quiet. Freud believed insomnia was not random. It was meaningful. The mind refusing sleep, because sleep means letting go of control, and control is the last defense. When you sleep, the sensor relaxes. Repressed material begins to rise. Dreams arrive. Feelings surface. And for some people, that is too dangerous. So they stay awake. Not consciously, not by choice, but the mind keeps them vigilant because sleep feels like vulnerability, and vulnerability feels like death. Freud saw this in trauma survivors, especially the person who was hurt at night, the child who was not safe in their bed. The adult body remembers, and it says, do not sleep, it is not safe, even though the danger is long past, even though the room is safe now. The body does not know that. It only knows the pattern, and so it keeps you awake. Freud believed the path to sleep was the same as the path to healing. You had to face what you had been avoiding, not all at once, not recklessly, but slowly, with support. You had to let the repressed material surface in therapy, in journaling, in quiet reflection. You had to give it a place to go during the day, so it did not have to come at night. And you had to reassure the body, you are safe now. The danger is over. You can rest, not with words, with experience, with nights where nothing bad happens, with mornings where you wake and you are still here. Over time, the body learns. Sleep is not death, it is just sleep, and the mind slowly lets go. Not perfectly, not every night, but more often And the dreams, when they come, are no longer quite so terrifying, because you have begun to understand their language. You know what they are trying to say, and you are listening. Let your breath slow for a moment. Feel the weight of your body where it rests. You do not have to solve anything tonight. You just have to let tonight be enough. Freud's work was not about curing you. It was about helping you see yourself clearly, to understand why you do what you do, feel what you feel, fear what you fear, and in that understanding, to find a little more freedom, a little more choice, a little more peace. The memory you buried is still there, but maybe now it does not have to wake you. Maybe now you can let it rest, and you can rest too.